The winter of 1886 arrived 3 weeks before anyone expected it, in the valley settlements that stretched along the eastern face of the Beartooth Range. The old-timers had read the signs throughout October with the confidence of men who had survived 5, 10, 15 seasons in this particular geography. The woolly bears were dark at the middle, which meant a hard season, they said, but manageable. The geese had moved south early, which confirmed a cold arrival, but the snow had come lightly so far and the soil had not yet frozen to the depth that meant real trouble. By the 3rd week of November, the consensus among the men who gathered at the Halverson trading post each week was that the winter would be stern but survivable, provided a man had prepared properly and kept his livestock sheltered and his feed supply well in hand. Elias Kern had prepared differently. He had spent the better part of September and October 3 miles up the valley from the settlement, in and around a limestone formation the locals called the Goat Walls, working alone with a pickaxe, 2 mules, and a hand-built wooden sledge that he used to haul materials up from the valley floor. The settlement watched him go each morning and come back each evening with the particular attention that small communities give behavior they find both incomprehensible and slightly threatening. A man could be tolerated for doing something unusual. He became a problem when the unusual thing he was doing cast an implicit judgment on the usual things everyone else was doing. What Elias was doing looked, from the valley, like digging. He had found the cave system in August while tracking a lame steer that had wandered up the rocky face, looking for the last of the high grass. The cave was not large by the measures that mattered to explorers. The main chamber extended perhaps 40 feet into the rock face, with a narrowing passage that dropped into darkness at the far end. But what Elias noticed was not the size of it. He pressed his palm against a limestone wall well inside the chamber, past the point where outdoor air could reasonably be expected to have any influence, and held it there for a long time. The stone was not warm. Calling it warm would have been wrong. But it was not cold in the way that deep stone in mountain country should have been cold in late August, when the nights were already turning and the highest peaks had taken their first dusting of snow. It held a temperature that was simply stable, indifferent to the season, the way very deep things are indifferent to what moves on the surface. He had pressed that same palm against the limestone walls of his grandfather's root cellar in the hill country of central Pennsylvania 40 years before, as a child, and the sensation had been the same. He filed this away. He returned to his steer. 3 weeks later, after a night in which he had lain awake listening to particular quality of silence that arrives before deep cold moves down from the northern ranges, he had a conversation with his wife, Marin, that lasted less than 10 minutes. She had listened without interrupting. When he finished, she had looked at the window for a moment. "How sure?" she had asked. He had not answered with a number or a word. He had gotten up and begun making a list. Elias Kern was not, by the accounting of the valley settlement, a man with credentials. He had arrived 4 years earlier from no place anyone had thought to look into, traveling with a wife and a daughter and 2 mules and more tools than one man seemed to need. He was approximately 50 years old, which meant he was old enough to have come from somewhere and accumulated knowledge from that somewhere, but not old enough to have established any of it as visible fact in the community's estimation. He had built a small house, kept a clean fence line, traded fairly, and generally avoided the kinds of conflict that generate reputation. He was known, when he was known at all, as competent and quiet. Quiet did not translate to respected. In a community where reputation was built on visible performance, on the quality of man's fence posts and the conformation of his cattle, and the number of hard winters he had personally navigated, Elias occupied a position that was technically neutral but practically invisible. He had understood this. It had not concerned him until a morning in late September, when he walked to the trading post and attempted to share what he believed he knew about the coming winter. He had framed it simply. He had said that based on what he had observed in the upper valley and in the behavior of the elk herds over the past 6 weeks and in the specific quality of the first 3 storms of the season, He believed this winter would arrive earlier and run harder and longer than the community was currently preparing for, and that he intended to make certain preparations that departed from a conventional approach. He had not recommended that anyone else follow him. He had simply stated what he intended to do and why, in case the information was useful to someone. The room had received this with particular silence that precedes laughter in situations where the laughter has already been decided, but courtesy requires a brief pause. Martin Halverson, who ran the Trading Post and whose opinion on practical matters carried the weight of 40 years in the valley, had said, not unkindly, that a man could prepare for any winter he liked, but that spreading alarm based on elk behavior and personal feeling was more likely to cause unnecessary hardship than prevent any. 3 other men had said variations of the same thing, with decreasing kindness as the conversation continued. One man, a cattleman named Pugh who ran the largest operation in the valley, had said something about profits that earned a long laugh from everyone present, including from men who would not have laughed so readily had the speaker been someone other than Pugh. Elias had finished his coffee. He had put the cup down carefully. He had walked to the door and stopped and said something that no one in the room had understood. He said, "The stone doesn't lie." He went out. The door closed. The laughter resumed. He had come to the cave system in mid-August with the instinct that a man carries when he has been wrong once in a way that costs him everything. The details of the cost were not things he discussed in the valley settlement, and the settlement had not pressed him, and the story had remained his own. He had been a farmer in the hill country. He had relied on his family's inherited knowledge of winters past, on the felt certainty of community that had managed that particular geography for 3 generations, on the confidence that comes from pattern and precedent. He had believed the season was ordinary when it was not. He had not built the second storage. He had not extended the shelter the way he had considered extending it and had put off. The winter had arrived in force and held for 11 weeks, and when it lifted, he had lost the cattle and the root stores, and eventually, through a sequence of events that no longer mattered in their particulars, the farm itself. He had spent 2 years afterward learning what he had not known, not from books or not primarily, from men who had survived worse. From an old Norwegian settler in Minnesota who had built into a hillside rather than on top of one, and had explained the principle to Elias over the course of an afternoon in terms so plain that Elias had felt, for a moment, the specific shame of having been told something that should have been obvious. From the soil itself, which communicated things to a man who was willing to put his hands in it and pay attention to what he found. From the quality of stone walls in root cellars and spring houses and old fortifications, which held temperature in a way that walls never could, in which he had spent 2 years touching with the focused attention of a student who had learned too late that there was something to study. The cave system in the goat walls was not what he had been looking for when he found it. He had been looking, in the general sense that a man carries a problem in the back of his mind for long enough that his eyes begin to scan for its solution unconsciously, for a way to shelter cattle through a severe winter without the catastrophic feed loss that came from keeping large animals in above-ground structures during sustained extreme cold. The hill-built Norwegian settler had talked about temperature stability. The cave offered temperature stability that no constructed structure could match. The limestone held its 48 degrees regardless of what was happening outside, and 48 degrees was not warmth, but it was survival, and it was a difference between a metabolic crisis in an animal that was burning everything it had against the cold and a metabolic state that left something in reserve. What he built over September and October was not elegant. It was a series of modifications to the cave system that were invisible from the outside and fundamental from the inside. He widened the entrance enough to admit cattle, which required careful work along the limestone face, with the understanding that every modification made to rock takes back something that cannot be restored. He built a deflection wall inside the first few feet of the entrance, angled so that the prevailing wind from the northwest would strike the wall and redirect rather than driving cold air directly into the chamber. He packed the floor of the main chamber with a deep layer of dry grass and straw that he had hauled up on the sledge through 11 separate trips, each trip watched from the valley by whoever happened to be looking in that direction. He installed a simple drainage channel along the floor's low side to carry moisture out from the rear of the chamber, a detail he had nearly overlooked and caught only because he spent a full day inside the cave during a rainstorm and observed where the water moved. The deflection wall had a secondary function he had not initially planned. The air that entered the cave was slowed by the wall and warmed slightly by contact with the accumulated heat of the limestone before it reached the animals, which was not warm air by any reasonable standard, but was air that had given up something of its edge. By mid-October the work was done, and from the valley it still looked like digging. He brought his 12 cattle up on the 14th of November, 10 days before the first serious snow. The neighbors who watched them go could find no useful category for what they were seeing. A man driving his cattle uphill, away from the shelters and feed stores of the valley floor, toward a limestone formation that offered nothing visible to the eye. Pugh rode past that morning and did not stop, but the look he cast over his shoulder was a kind that makes a remark of its own, without requiring words. Maren and their daughter Ingrid had moved what they needed up to the cave site by the end of that first week. Maren had not protested the plan. She had said once that she wished the cave were larger, not as a criticism but as a practical observation, and Elias had agreed that it was a reasonable wish. She spent the cold days in a small structure he had built against the cave's external face, insulated from below and above with the straw that remained from the cave floor supply, and she managed the cattle with the same economy of motion that she applied to everything she did, which was the economy of a woman who had understood for some years that the distance between sufficiency and failure was narrower than most people wanted to believe. The dog, a short-haired brown animal of indeterminate heritage named Sable, who had followed Elias home from the trading post 3 years earlier and had never been formally invited but had also never been formally declined, had been in the habit of sleeping near the door of the house, where there was drafts but also the sounds of the outside. At the cave, he moved without hesitation to the far interior corner against the warmest of the limestone walls and stayed there. He did not do this because he had been told to. He had not been told anything. He simply went to where the rock was warmest and remained. Elias watched this and said nothing. The snow began in earnest on the 21st of November, for days earlier than the valley's collective memory recorded any comparable accumulation, and by the third day it was clear that this was not an ordinary storm. The wind came from a direction that brought the temperature down in a way that bypassed the modulating influence of the valley's geography and struck everything with equal force. The settlement's cattle shelters, constructed with the logic of average winters and the materials of a community that had survived average winters, began to show their limitations. Animals that were supposed to be protected were burning through metabolic reserves at rates that alarmed the stockmen who checked on them each morning. Elias could not see the settlement from the cave. He knew only what was happening where he was. What was happening where he was. The temperature inside the cave's main chamber, which he had measured each morning with a thermometer purchased from a mail-order cataloged the previous spring, held within 4 degrees of its pre-storm baseline for the duration of the event. Outside the cave, Maren had hung a second thermometer from the exterior frame of the small attached structure, and the difference between the two readings on the third morning of the storm was 29 degrees. He wrote this in the small notebook he kept. He did not comment on it. He simply wrote the numbers and returned to checking the cattle. The cattle stood in the cave's main chamber in the deep straw, and were not comfortable in any sense that would satisfy a comfortable animal, but they were not in metabolic crisis. They were eating at roughly the rate he had calculated for sustained cold exposure above their normal temperature range, which was slower than the uncontrolled burning he had seen in cattle sheltered above ground in extreme cold. On the 6th day of the storm, he noted in the notebook that the water he had carried into the cave in 2 large buckets on the morning the storm broke had still not frozen. Outside, water left exposed for 10 minutes formed a skin of ice. He wrote this down. The storm broke on the 9th day. Halverson was the one who came up. He came alone, 3 days after the storm broke, riding through snow that had settled to a depth that required careful navigation, and he tied his horse below the cave system and climbed the last quarter-mile on foot. Elias saw him coming from the cave entrance and went to meet him at the base of the final rise. Halverson was not a man who showed much on his face, and he did not show much now. He looked at the cave entrance, at the deflection wall barely visible in the dimness within, at the steam rising from the cattle visible in the interior. He looked for a long time without saying anything. Elias waited. Halverson walked to the entrance and stood inside it, past the deflection wall, in the main chamber. The cattle moved without alarm. He put one hand out and laid it flat against the limestone wall of the chamber, in the way a man does when he is checking something that cannot be checked any other way. He held it there for some time. He looked at the thermometer mounted on a peg Elias had driven into a seam in the rock face. He looked at the notebook that Elias had left open on the flat stone he used as a work surface, open to the page with the 9 days of temperatures recorded in Elias's careful, unremarkable hand. He looked at it for a long time. "How many?" he said finally. Elias said nothing for a moment, then lost none. Halverson looked at the cattle. He looked at the notebook again. He put on his hat, which he had removed at some point without noticing. He walked to the cave entrance and stood looking out at the valley below, where the settlement was visible in the distance, reduced by snow and distance to something small and provisional. He said, "Pulos 23. Elias said nothing. Halverson descended without further conversation. 3 days later, a Sunday, Elias came down to the trading post for the first time since before the storm. He came because Marin had asked him to bring back salt and lamp oil, not for any other reason. The post was full. It was always full after a hard event, in the way that communities instinctively draw together after the thing they have feared in common has passed. He was aware of the change in the room before anyone spoke. It was in the quality of attention that came toward him when he entered, which was different from the quality of attention that had followed him before the storm. Before, the attention had the comfortable texture of shared amusement. Now it had something else in it, the discomfort of men who have been wrong and know it, and who are in the process of deciding how to be wrong, without losing the version of themselves that does not get things wrong. Pugh was in the post. He was standing at the far end of the room with his back partly turned, in the way of a large man who has learned that turning partly away can pass for not having noticed. He turned fully when Elias entered. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The stone." It was not a question. It was the rearrangement of a thing he had said in mockery into something that was now, in his mouth, simply a fact. Elias put his list on the counter. Halverson began to fill it without being asked. By February, 3 other Valley stockmen had asked Elias to show them the deflection wall. He showed them. He said little. He let them put their hands on a limestone and feel what he had felt in August, what his grandfather's root cellar wall had felt like, what the Norwegian settler's hillside had felt like when he had pressed his palm against it on that Minnesota afternoon. He answered questions when asked and did not offer interpretation. The stone held its temperature, or it did not. The animal survived, or they did not. The notebook contained what it contained. Halverson asked, one afternoon when they were alone in the cave together and the 3 inquiring stockmen had already gone, whether Elias had known with certainty before the winter came. Elias considered this for a long time. "I knew what the stone knew," he said, "which was more than I knew before." Halverson looked at the wall. He put his hand against it again, as if checking something that might have changed. It had not changed. It would not change. That was the nature of what it was. By the following fall, 2 other cave systems in the valley had been modified along the principles Elias had worked out through trial and correction, and the valley's losses in the second hard winter that followed were a fraction of what they had been. He was not present at any of the community discussions about this, and his name was not used as frequently as the principles themselves, which was how useful knowledge tends to travel when it is adopted honestly. It loses the person and keeps the thing. He was back at the cave in September, checking the deflection wall for the seasonal settling that rock and timber work experienced as temperatures moved. Sable was with him. And in the late afternoon, when the light inside the cave had shifted to a deep amber, the dog went to the same far interior corner against the warmest section of the limestone face, and lay down with the settled certainty of an animal that has found the place it intends to be. The stone held its 48 degrees. It would hold it through whatever came next. It had held it through whatever had come before. The cave did not know anything about the argument that had taken place 3 miles below in the valley, about the prophecy and the mockery, and the winter and the notebook, and Pugh's 23 cattle and Halverson's hand pressed against the wall. The cave knew only what it had always known, which was a slow, undisturbed temperature of the earth at a depth below the reach of weather. That was all it needed to know. That had always been enough.